In this video, we're going to go over how to use a query parameter like this, and then go over the difference between a post and GET request, and why you may want to use one over the other. Bam. So let's start out by updating our incredible server from last episode by adding a new path for a user to log in. So this /login. So when a user needs to log in, they typically need to pass a username or email and password. Now, we can't use the hello/name example. If we did, the user's password would be visible in the URL. So for example, if we did, then the user's password would be visible in the URL, just like this. And that's not very secure because it's right there for anyone over your shoulder to look at. Plus, browser history would literally have your password in it. So, how do we get the user's information from the user? Well, one way would be to use query parameters. While this isn't the proper thing to do for a password, it's still a fantastic way to send information to a server. So, for example here, we have app.route/login. Now, this is the same thing like we had before. But if we add a query parameter, just like this, like name, or we could say username, and then password equals 1234, right? Again, pretty terrible password. And also pretty terrible that it's just in the URL. But how this works is basically you add a question mark to the end of your URL, then you add the variable name, so in this case username, and then equals, and then whatever you want it to equal. Then if you want to add any more after that, you have to use an and then a username, and then a variable name, and then equals whatever. And if we wanted to add another, you just have to add another and test equals 1, 2, 3. You can just do that as long as you want, for the most part. I think there's probably a limit eventually, but probably not a big deal. So for Flask, how we actually do this is there's a request variable that is kind of already here by default within anything that has this decorator. So we can actually retrieve this information from this request.args. Args will contain the request arguments, which are basically just these things right here. So all we're doing here is just returning them, which is why we see the values here. This is just like in a dictionary, so it's a dictionary, key password kind of thing, or sorry, key value kind of thing. Now this is good, but clearly not the best, since the password would be in the URL just as a parameter, like we were talking about before. So let's talk about the difference between a GET request and a POST request. So far, what we've been doing is using GET requests. A GET request is typically the type of request that people send to a server when they first load a website. GET request. A GET request can send some basic information through the query parameters like we just showed, but it's all in the open because it's a part of the URL. So when you go to google.com, you're sending a GET request to the Google server, which then returns the Google homepage. So GET requests are meant to receive data from a server. Now, a POST request is meant to send data to a server. It may result in the server storing or updating something, and then typically returns some value. Because a POST request is able to send data to the server, it's what's used when you're signing into your favorite website. So the data is sent to the server as part of a request payload, usually called data or the body of the request. Let's look at an example. Now, I've updated our previous login function here to accept GET requests and POST requests. So let's run through this code real quickly. Basically, the first thing we're doing is getting any requests or any arguments just like before. The next thing we're doing is we're printing those, so we can print and look at them within the debugging console. Then we're going to check if it is a GET request or if it's a POST request. If it's a GET request, then things need to be query parameters because, again, we can't post things to the body. And in that case, we just return a dictionary, and we return text equals GET, plus the arguments if there's a name, and then we have some default things. So this is basically saying, get the name argument. If there is no name argument, set it to default to Sammy. If there is an age argument, get that. Otherwise, default it to 4. Oh, Sammy's actually 5 now. Wow, they grow up so fast. Now, if the request is not a not a GET request, then we're going to go into this else. And because we only accept GETs and posts, then it's going to have to be a post request. So when it's a post request, we can retrieve data from the body of the request. So we don't actually need to encode anything. Because one thing that is actually important with a query parameter, so again, something that is added to the end of a request, is that if you have a space or anything like that, it needs to be encoded because URLs can't have spaces. So if you want to add a space, you need to use %20, which basically is the encoded value of a space. Whereas with post requests, we don't need to do that because it's not added to the URL. Because a URL needs to be consistently a character and space isn't considered a character in this case, then we can just kind of have whatever we want in a post request, whereas we need the encoded value within a GET request. So in this case, this is a form. A form is usually what you use to log into something. So it has a username and a password and usually a button or something like that to sign in. This is the data. So the data is, and this is a little bit unique to Flask here, or like specific to Flask, but the data is actually the contents of the body. The body is typically a string or something like that. And when it's encoded or decoded, it's usually in the form of something called JSON. JSON just stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And it's basically equivalent to the dictionaries within Python. So in this case, for a post request, we're going to return the request.data. And if it's a GET request, we're going to return this dictionary with text equals a bunch of this stuff. Now, one thing that's kind of fun is that because this is a Python server, we can actually just trigger this from HTML, from a website. So I made this really simple website here that basically, it's just locally on my computer, so you can't access it. But basically all this does is it's just a container with 2 different forms. And then each form has a little bit of JavaScript that either sends the request as a GET request with some URL parameters, or sends it as a post request with a body specified. Now, the important thing to note here is that when I'm doing this, I also am going to be adding the results of the request into this div. We'll talk about that kind of stuff eventually if we want to go into websites more, and also the type. So this will say the GET, it will say whether it's a GET request or a post request, as well as what the URL is we're sending. All right, let's take a look at this website. So all we have here is when we do a GET request, we're going to send the name. And if I submit this, we can see that we're sending it to this URL with a name query parameter of test. And the response we're getting back is text get test is 5 years old. Or Sammy, 5 years old, right? Now, we can even verify this using the inspector. This is something that you don't need to know how to use right now, but just kind of as proof of that we're actually doing a request here, we can do a click here and we can see that we get this here. And if we go ahead and look at this request, we can see that we are sending it to this 127.0.0.1, 5000, login, Sammy, GET. It is a GET request. And the payload is a query string parameter, which is Sammy. Perfect. Now let's test with the, let's do Jake, submit a post request. When we submit the post request, we can see that the URL is actually just login. We don't have anything at the end, but the value we still get back is Jake, because if we look at our server here, we're going to respond with the data. So if we go and look at this, we can still see that the request payload still has a name and Jake, just like the Sammy one did. It's just not a query string parameter. Now it's just request payload. If we go ahead and look at the headers for this, we can still see that it's just requesting from login. There's no query parameter or anything, and it's a post request. So again, remember, if you were going to use a GET request, it's because you want to get some information from the server, and you don't necessarily care about what type of information you're sending to the server. if you are sending information, make sure that that information is not something that's sensitive. So no passwords or anything like that. If you want to send something like that or send information to the server, like a password, use a post request. And in that case, you can put it into the body of the request and then access it through this request.data. This is very, very basic. Literally the body, method post, and then the URL that we're setting. All of this is up on GitHub. So if you want to take a look at this and play with this yourself, feel free to go ahead and do that. So hopefully that helps now that you know the difference between a GET request and a post, and you can kind of build your server accordingly. In the next video, we're going to go over how you can use Flask to host a very simple website using a form of template. Then we'll go over databases, how to test our APIs or servers, and maybe we'll actually make a simple website that can actually interface and use our API. If you really want, I can actually even show you how to make it so that your API can be accessible to the rest of the world, like through the internet. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe down below and like the video. It helps out a ton. And remember, I'm Jake. You're awesome. And this has been GET requests and post requests for a simple Python server. Cheers.